March 10, 1945. A cold rain fell on Camp Crossroads, Pennsylvania, as a transport truck carrying 32 German women prisoners rolled through the gates. These weren't the first prisoners of war to arrive at American facilities, but they were among the few groups of women captured from the German Women's Auxiliary Corps during the final collapse of the Third Reich in Europe. What made their arrival different wasn't their gender or their defeated status. It was what they carried in their hollow eyes and gaunt faces, a hunger so deep it had become part of their identity. Before we discover what happened when these starving women encountered American abundance, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. 24-year-old Helena Richter stepped off the truck with careful, measured movements. Every motion was calculated to conserve energy, a habit born from months of surviving on shrinking rations. She had served as a radio operator in Berlin until the city's infrastructure crumbled around her. Capture had come during the chaotic retreat westward, when her unit dissolved into scattered groups of desperate soldiers trying to avoid the advancing Soviet forces. Now she stood in an American prison camp, wearing a gray auxiliary uniform that hung loose on her diminished frame. Beside her, 21-year-old Marguerite Schmidt, called Greta by everyone who knew her, clutched her stomach reflexively. The truck ride had made her dizzy, though whether from motion or malnutrition, she couldn't say. Greta had been a clerk in Munich before joining the auxiliary service, believing she was contributing to her country's defense. The reality of war had proven far different from the propaganda posters. She had learned that hunger was a constant companion, that the ache in your belly eventually became background noise you barely noticed. Frida Klein, at 27, the oldest of the three, surveyed the camp with the wary assessment of someone who had survived too much to trust appearances. Her hands trembled slightly, not from cold but from the physical toll of prolonged malnutrition. She had watched friends collapse from starvation during the final months of the war. She had seen what desperation did to human dignity. Now she expected nothing from her captors except perhaps the minimum required by international law. Anything more would be a dangerous illusion. Captain Dorothy Hayes watched the women file into formation. She had overseen male prisoner transfers before, but something about these hollow-cheeked women struck her differently. They stood with military bearing despite their obvious physical decline, maintaining dignity even as their bodies betrayed the deprivation they had endured. She noticed how their eyes followed the American guards not with defiance or fear, but with a calculating emptiness. These were people who had learned not to hope for anything beyond survival. What none of them knew yet was that their understanding of survival was about to be completely transformed. The hunger they had accepted as permanent was about to meet an abundance they couldn't have imagined. And it would begin with something as simple as their first American meal. The mess hall looked like every military dining facility Helena had ever seen, with long tables arranged in precise rows and the institutional smell of industrial cooking hanging in the air. But when the American guards directed the German women to sit, something felt wrong. The tables were set with actual plates, not tin mess kits. There were forks and knives laid out as if this were a restaurant rather than a prison camp. Helena exchanged glances with Greta, both women confused by these unexpected details. Corporal James Bennett, a young guard from Ohio, began explaining the meal schedule in slow, carefully pronounced English. Most of the German women understood only fragments, but the gestures toward the kitchen made the basic meaning clear. They would eat soon. Helena's stomach clenched at the thought. She had learned not to anticipate meals, as disappointment hurt worse than simple hunger. When the kitchen staff emerged carrying trays, the women's collective intake of breath was audible. Private Walter Chen, a Chinese-American from San Francisco, set a plate in front of Helena that made her blink in disbelief. Mashed potatoes formed a generous mound on one side. Green beans, actually green rather than the gray-brown of overboiled vegetables, occupied another section. And there, taking up nearly half the plate, sat 2 thick slices of meatloaf with rich brown gravy pooled around them. Greta stared at her identical plate, as if it might vanish if she looked away. This was more food than she had seen in a single meal in over a year. Her hands remained in her lap, unmoving. Around the mess hall, the other German women sat frozen, none of them reaching for their forks. They had been trained by deprivation to expect tricks, To anticipate that abundance was always an illusion, Frida finally spoke in German, her voice barely a whisper. "Is this for all of us, or are they testing to see who takes food first?" The question reflected the paranoia that came from living under constant scarcity. In the final months of the war, extra rations had sometimes been traps, used to identify hoarders or test loyalty. The women had learned that generosity often came with hidden costs. Sergeant Patrick O'Brien, whose Irish grandparents had fled their own famine 70 years earlier, recognized the paralysis of people who couldn't trust food in front of them. He picked up his own fork and began eating from an identical plate, making exaggerated gestures of enjoyment. "It's real," he said in his thick Boston accent. "It's yours. Eat." His tone was gentle but firm, as if he were coaxing frightened children rather than commanding enemy prisoners. Helena lifted her fork with a trembling hand. She cut a small piece of Creole, a meatloaf, half expecting someone to stop her. When no one did, she brought it to her mouth. The taste of seasoned beef, real meat with actual fat content, hit her tongue like a memory of a life she had almost forgotten existed. Around the hall, other women began to eat, slowly at first, then with increasing desperation. Sergeant Patrick O'Brien had seen plenty of prisoners of war during his 2 years stationed at various camps across the northeastern United States. He had processed Italian soldiers who joked and sang despite their captivity, and German men who maintained rigid military discipline even in defeat. But he had never seen prisoners eat the way these women ate. They didn't just consume their food. They attacked it with a desperation that made him physically uncomfortable to witness. Helena finished her entire plate in less than 5 minutes, using bread to wipe up every trace of gravy. Her hands moved with mechanical efficiency, as if her body had taken over from her conscious mind. When she finally set down her fork, she looked around the mess hall with something approaching panic in her eyes. The plate was empty. The abundance had been temporary, just as she had suspected it would be. Greta had eaten more slowly, but only because her shrunken stomach rebelled against the sudden influx of rich food. She felt simultaneously satisfied and desperately hungry, her body confused by the contradiction. Beside her, Frida had tears running down her face as she chewed, though she seemed unaware she was crying. The simple act of eating a full meal had broken through the emotional numbness that had kept her functioning through months of deprivation. O'Brien noticed something else that troubled him. Several of the women were slipping pieces of bread into their pockets when they thought no one was looking. Old habits from surviving in a world where the next meal was never guaranteed. He caught the eye of Corporal Bennett and shook his head slightly, signaling him not to intervene. These women weren't stealing. They were surviving the only way they knew how. After the meal, Captain Hayes called O'Brien to her office. She had observed the same disturbing details he had noticed. "Sergeant, I need you to coordinate with Private Chen in the kitchen. I want these women on an increased caloric intake, but we need to do it gradually. Their bodies can't handle sudden abundance after prolonged starvation. We'll start with 4 meals a day instead of 3, smaller portions but more frequent." O'Brien nodded, understanding the medical logic. He had read reports about liberated concentration camp prisoners who had died from refeeding syndrome when well-meaning rescuers gave them too much food too quickly. These German women prisoners weren't in that extreme condition, but they were clearly malnourished enough to require careful management. That evening, O'Brien made his rounds through the barracks. Through the windows he could see the women talking, in hushed German, their animated gestures suggesting intense discussion. He didn't need to understand their language to know what they were debating. Was the food real? Would it continue? Were they being fattened up for some darker purpose? Trust didn't come easily to people who had been betrayed by their own country's promises of victory and prosperity. He made a decision then that would change everything. Tomorrow, he would make sure these women understood that American abundance wasn't a trick. It was simply how things were done here. The next morning brought another shock that the German women struggled to process. Breakfast arrived with scrambled eggs, actual eggs with rich yellow color, not the powdered substitute they had become accustomed to in Germany. Beside the eggs sat thick slices of toast, and on each table, small dishes of butter sat glistening under the mess hall lights. Real butter, not the gray margarine that had become the only option in the final years of the war. Helena stared at the butter dish as if it were made of gold. She remembered butter from her childhood in Berlin, before the war had consumed everything. Her mother used to spread it thick on warm bread on Sunday mornings, a small luxury that made the day feel special. That memory seemed to belong to a different person, living in a different world. She reached out tentatively, took a small portion, and spread it carefully on her toast. The taste, when it hit her tongue, brought an involuntary sound from her throat, something between a gasp and a sob. It wasn't just the richness of the dairy fat or the salt that made her taste buds come alive. It was the realization that she had been living in deprivation for so long that she had forgotten what normal food tasted like. The propaganda had told them that Germany was winning, that sacrifices were temporary, that abundance would return with victory. All lies. Greta ate more slowly this time, her body adjusting to regular meals after just one day. She watched Private Chen as he moved between the tables, refilling coffee cups with dark, aromatic brew. Real coffee, not the chicory substitute or acorn mixture that had passed for coffee in Germany. She couldn't help but wonder how America had so much when Germany, which had controlled half of Europe, had been starving its people. Across the table, Frida spoke quietly in German. "They feed their prisoners better than our government fed its soldiers." The observation hung heavy in the air. Other women nodded slowly, the implications of that simple truth beginning to reshape their understanding of everything they had been told about the war, about America, about their own country's priorities. Sergeant O'Brien watched from his position near the door. He saw the moment when disbelief began to shift into something else. Not quite trust, but perhaps the foundation of it. These women were starting to understand that the abundance wasn't temporary, wasn't conditional, wasn't a trick. This was simply the standard. He remembered his grandmother's stories about arriving in Boston from Ireland, about her amazement at American plenty after the deprivation of the famine. These German women were having their own version of that revelation. Corporal Bennett approached O'Brien with a question. "Sergeant, some of the women are asking about seconds. Should we allow it?" O'Brien considered the medical advice from Captain Hayes about gradual increases, but he also understood the psychological importance of this moment. Let them have seconds if they want. But remind Chen to keep the portions reasonable. We're building trust here, not just feeding bodies. By the end of breakfast, something had shifted in the mess hall. The women were talking more freely, their voices less hushed. A few even smiled. March 17th arrived with unusual activity in the camp kitchen. Private Chen had been working since dawn, but the day's menu wasn't his creation. Sergeant O'Brien had requested special permission from Captain Hayes to prepare a traditional Irish meal for St. Patrick's Day, and surprisingly, she had agreed. "If we're going to show them what America is about," she had said, "we might as well show them all of it, including how we celebrate." The German women noticed the different smells wafting from the kitchen during their morning work assignments. Something rich and savory, mixed with an earthy vegetable aroma they couldn't quite identify. Helena, who had been assigned to help with administrative filing, asked Corporal Bennett about the unusual preparations. He grinned and said something about a special holiday, but her English wasn't good enough yet to understand the details. When lunchtime arrived, the mess hall had been decorated with green paper streamers that O'Brien and Chen had salvaged from storage. A small hand-lettered sign read, "Happy St. Patrick's Day," in both English and, somewhat awkwardly, in German. The women filed in with curiosity, replacing their usual mealtime wariness. After a week of regular, generous meals, they had begun to believe that the food was real and would continue. But nothing had prepared them for what came next. Private Chen and two other kitchen staff members emerged carrying enormous platters. The portions they placed before each woman made the previous meals look modest by comparison. A massive slice of corned beef, pink and tender, dominated the plate. Beside it sat a mountain of boiled cabbage, still bright green and steaming. Boiled potatoes, carrots, and a thick slice of brown bread with butter completed the feast. Greta simply stared at her plate, unable to process what she was seeing. This wasn't prison food. This wasn't even military rations. This was the kind of meal wealthy families in Munich might have served before the war, when food was abundant and celebrations were common. Her hands remained frozen in her lap as she tried to reconcile the reality before her with everything she thought she knew about captivity. O'Brien stood at the front of the mess hall and explained in his enthusiastic way, gesturing broadly, "Today is St. Patrick's Day. In America, especially for us Irish, we celebrate with this meal, corned beef and cabbage. It's tradition." He paused, then added with genuine warmth, "And in America, everyone's a little bit Irish on St. Patrick's Day. Even you, ladies." Helena understood enough of his words to grasp the basic meaning. This abundance, this feast, was for a celebration, and somehow, impossibly, they were being included in it. Not as enemies, not as prisoners, but as people who deserved to share in the joy of the day. She picked up her fork and cut into the corned beef. The meat fell apart at the slightest pressure, tender and seasoned with spices she couldn't name. Around the hall, the other women began to eat, and then something unprecedented happened. They couldn't stop. Not because they were starving anymore, but because the food was genuinely delicious, and for the first time in years, they were allowed to enjoy a meal without guilt or fear. Frida took her third bite of corned beef and felt something break inside her. Not physically, but something deeper. A wall she had built around her heart to survive the war, to endure the lies, to keep functioning when everything she believed had crumbled. This simple act of including enemy prisoners in an American holiday celebration had accomplished what months of defeat and capture had not. It made her question everything. She looked around the mess hall and saw the same realization dawning on other faces. These American soldiers weren't monsters. They weren't the cruel oppressors that German propaganda had described. They were men who celebrated their heritage with food and wanted to share that joy even with their enemies. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. How could the same country that was destroying Germany in battle also be the country that served feasts to its past prisoners? Helena had stopped eating, her fork suspended halfway to her mouth. She was watching Sergeant O'Brien as he moved between the tables, clearly pleased with himself for organizing this meal. He stopped to refill water glasses, to answer questions in his patient, broken German, to ensure everyone had enough of everything. There was no calculation in his kindness, no sense that he expected anything in return. He simply seemed to believe that this was the right way to treat people, even people whose country had been at war with his. Greta leaned over and whispered to Helena in German. "My brother wrote to me before I lost contact with him. He was being held in a British camp. He said they gave them tea and biscuits, but nothing like this. He said the British were correct, but cold. This," she gestured at the overflowing plate, "this is something else entirely." Across the table, a woman named Elsa spoke up, her voice carrying a tremor of emotion. "I worked in the propaganda office in Hamburg. I typed reports about American brutality, about how they bombed civilians without mercy, about how they were coming to destroy our way of life." She paused, tears forming in her eyes. "We wrote those things while we were starving, and now I'm eating better as their prisoner than I ever did as a free German." The observation sparked a wave of similar confessions throughout the hall. Other women began sharing their experiences with propaganda, with the lies they had been told, with the growing realization that their own government had been their real enemy all along. The corned beef and cabbage had become more than just a meal. It had become a catalyst for truth. Private Chen noticed that several women had barely touched their food, too overwhelmed by emotion to eat. He approached their table quietly and spoke in his gentle way. "Take your time. Food will stay warm. No rush." His broken English somehow made the message more sincere. These men were trying to communicate across a language barrier, across a war, across every reason they should hate each other simply because they believed in treating people with dignity. Helena finally resumed eating, but slowly now, deliberately savoring each bite. She was memorizing this moment, this meal, this feeling of being treated as human, rather than as enemy. She knew that whatever happened next, whether they were eventually sent back to Germany or kept in America, this St. Patrick's Day would mark the moment when everything changed. 2 days after St. Patrick's Day, Captain Hayes announced that the women would be permitted to write letters home through the International Red Cross. The news brought a complicated mixture of relief and dread. They wanted desperately to contact their families, to know who had survived the war's final months, but they also faced an impossible question. How could they describe their current situation without seeming to betray their country, or worse, without rubbing salt in wounds they knew were raw? Helena sat in the barracks common room with a piece of paper in front of her and a pencil in her hand. She had been staring at the blank page for 20 minutes. How could she tell her mother, if her mother was even alive, that she was eating 3 full meals a day plus snacks, that she had gained weight since becoming a prisoner, that American soldiers served her feasts, while German civilians were reportedly eating grass and tree bark to survive? She finally began to write, choosing her words with excruciating care. Dear Mama, I am alive and safe. I am being held in an American prison camp in Pennsylvania. We are treated according to international law. Please write to me if you receive this letter. I need to know you survived. Your daughter, Helena. She stared at the inadequate words. Everything important remained unsaid, trapped between loyalty and honesty. Greta took a different approach. She decided to risk the truth, or at least part of it. Dear Papa, you would not believe the food they give us here. Yesterday we had roasted chicken with vegetables. Today, beef stew with fresh bread. I know this will be hard to read when you are struggling, but I need you to understand something. We were lied to. About everything. The Americans are not what we were told. I am safe. I am fed. I am beginning to understand how terribly wrong we were. She sealed the letter knowing it might never reach her father, or worse, that it might reach him and break his heart. But she couldn't bring herself to lie anymore. The corned beef and cabbage had been a turning point. She couldn't pretend that her captivity was hardship when it was actually salvation. Frida wrote the most painful letter of all. She had learned through Red Cross channels that her husband had been killed during the defense of Berlin. Her 2 sons, ages 8 and 11, were somewhere in the Soviet occupation zone with her sister. My dearest boys, Mama is alive and safe in the Devon, America. I am eating well and staying strong so that someday I can find you again. The people here are kind. Do not be afraid of Americans if you ever meet them. They are not our enemies. They never were. I love you more than words can say. Throughout the barracks, similar scenes played out. Women wrestling with impossible truths, trying to compress months of transformation into letters that would pass through military censors. Some chose silence about the food, fearing their families would think them traitors for thriving in captivity. Others, like Greta, chose brutal honesty, hoping the truth might somehow help their loved ones understand the magnitude of the lies they had all been told. Sergeant O'Brien collected the letters that evening. He had been warned by Captain Hayes to read them for security purposes, but as he scanned the carefully written words, he found himself moved by their raw honesty. Private Walter Chen had a problem, and it was a problem he never expected to face. In a prisoner of war camp, he needed more kitchen help. The regular meals for 32 women, plus the American staff, had become more elaborate as Captain Hayes approved increasingly generous menus. Chen, who had learned to cook in his family's restaurant in San Francisco's Chinatown, found himself overwhelmed by the workload. When he mentioned this to Sergeant O'Brien, the solution seemed obvious. Several of the German women had indicated previous cooking experience on their intake forms. Why not put them to work in the kitchen? O'Brien brought the proposal to Captain Hayes, who considered it carefully. Allowing prisoners into the kitchen meant giving them access to knives, to potential weapons, to supplies that could be hoarded or stolen. But it also meant showing trust, and trust was what they were building here. Helena was among the first 5 women selected for kitchen duty. When Corporal Bennett escorted her to the kitchen on a cool April morning, she felt a flutter of nervousness that had nothing to do with fear. She was about to work alongside the men who had been feeding her, about to learn the secrets of the abundance that had transformed her understanding of captivity. Chen greeted her with a slight bow, a gesture from his Chinese heritage that somehow felt appropriate for this momentous occasion. The language barrier immediately presented challenges. Chen spoke minimal German, and Helena's English, while improving, was still basic. But food, they discovered, had its own language. Chen demonstrated techniques with his hands, showed her the measurements he used, guided her through the proper way to season meat. Helena watched with the intensity of someone memorizing sacred texts. These weren't just cooking methods. They were proof that abundance was possible, that food could be more than mere survival. Within days, the kitchen had become the heart of an unexpected cultural exchange. Greta joined the rotation and taught Chen how to make Kartoffelpuffer, German potato pancakes, using the camp's plentiful potato supply. Chen, in turn, showed the women how to make simple stir-fry dishes with the Asian techniques his mother had taught him. Frida demonstrated the proper way to make spätzle, though the resulting noodles were incorporated into an American chicken soup that would have scandalized traditional German cooks. The conversations in the kitchen, conducted in broken English and German supplemented with elaborate hand gestures, covered more than just recipes. Chen told stories about his parents' immigration from China, about facing discrimination in America despite being born in San Francisco. Helena shared memories of Berlin before the war, when different cultures had mingled freely in the city's cafes and theaters. They discovered that being treated as foreign, as other, was an experience that transcended nationality. Sergeant O'Brien made a habit of stopping by the kitchen during meal preparations. He noticed how the women's faces had changed. The hollow desperation had been replaced by concentration, by purpose, by something that looked almost like contentment. Helena had gained enough weight that her uniform no longer hung loose on her frame. Her hands, steady now and no longer trembling, moved with confidence as she chopped vegetables. One afternoon, as Helena helped Chen prepare dinner, she paused and spoke carefully in English. "Private Chen, I must ask question." Chen looked up from the pot he was stirring. "Why you are so kind to us? We are enemy." Chen considered the question seriously before responding in his own careful English. Chen's answer to Helena's question was simple but profound. "My parents taught me that people are people. War is something governments do. Kindness is something people do." He stirred the pot thoughtfully before continuing. "In San Francisco, people treated my family like we were enemy too, even though we are American. I know what it feels like to be judged for things you cannot control, so I choose to see people, not enemies." His words settled over Helena like a weight. She had been part of a system that reduced people to categories, to useful or useless, to Aryan or subhuman, to ally or enemy. The simplicity of Chen's philosophy, that people were simply people, felt revolutionary. She returned to chopping vegetables, but her mind was elsewhere, wrestling with implications that extended far beyond the kitchen. May arrived with news that changed everything. The war in Europe had officially ended. Hitler was dead. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The women gathered in the mess hall to hear Captain Hayes explain what this meant for their status. Repatriation procedures would begin soon. They would be processed and returned to Germany within months, perhaps weeks. The announcement should have brought relief, even joy. Instead, it brought a heavy silence. That evening, Helena sat with Greta and Frida in their barracks, speaking in German for the first time in days. They had grown accustomed to speaking English, to functioning in this American world. The prospect of returning to Germany felt like being asked to go backward into darkness after experiencing light. "What is there to go back to?" Frida asked quietly. "My husband is dead. My sons are in the Soviet zone where I cannot reach them. Berlin is rubble. What life awaits me there?" Greta voiced what others were thinking but afraid to say. "Here, I have purpose. I help in the kitchen. I am learning English well now. People treat me with respect. In Germany, I will be seen as a failure, as someone who was captured, as someone who collaborated with the enemy by working with them." She gestured around the barracks. "This has become more of a home than Munich ever was." Helena understood their feelings because she shared them. But she also felt the pull of duty, the sense that abandoning Germany in its darkest hour was a kind of betrayal. "We cannot simply choose the easier path because America has better food," she said, though her words lacked conviction. "Our country needs rebuilding. Our people are suffering." "Our country," Frida replied bitterly, "created the suffering. Our government lied to us, starved us, and led us into a war that destroyed everything. Why do we owe loyalty to that?" The question hung unanswered in the air. Over the following days, the women had similar conversations throughout the camp. Some felt duty-bound to return despite the hardship. Others began to whisper about the possibility of staying, though no one knew if such a thing was even possible. The choice between going home hungry or staying fed had become a choice between duty and survival, between loyalty and self-preservation. 20 years after that St. Patrick's Day meal, Helena Richter stood in her kitchen in Philadelphia, preparing corned beef and cabbage for her American husband and 3 children. She had become Helena Richardson after marrying a veteran who had visited the camp as part of a church outreach program. Her English was flawless now, marked only by the faintest accent that her children found charming. But every March 17th, when she prepared this meal, she was transported back to that moment when everything changed. Of the 32 German women who had arrived at Camp Crossroads in March 1945, 18 had chosen to remain in America. The process had been complicated, requiring sponsorships, legal petitions, and navigation through immigration bureaucracy that seemed designed to discourage them. But Sergeant O'Brien, Private Chen, and Captain Hayes had all written letters on their behalf, testifying to their character and their transformation. Local families, including Mrs. Catherine Walsh, who had visited the camp regularly, had offered sponsorships and housing. Greta had settled in Boston, where she eventually opened a small bakery that specialized in both German and American pastries. She never married, pouring her energy instead into her business and into helping other refugees navigate their new American lives. Her bakery became a gathering place for immigrants from across Europe, all of them rebuilding lives in a country that had once been their enemy. Frida had been reunited with her sons in 1948 after 3 years of tireless work through Red Cross channels and displaced persons organizations. They had survived the Soviet occupation and made their way to the American zone. When they finally arrived in America, they were thin and traumatized, but alive. Frida's sons were now grown men, college-educated, fully American in their attitudes and aspirations. They had never fully understood their mother's stories about the prison camp, where she had learned to trust again. The women who had returned to Germany had faced harder paths, but they too had carried something valuable with them. They had experienced an alternative to hatred, proof that former enemies could extend kindness. Several had become teachers, social workers, and community leaders in the new democratic Germany, quietly spreading the lessons they had learned about reconciliation and human dignity. Helena's youngest daughter interrupted her reverie. "Mama, why do you always make this same meal on St. Patrick's Day?" "We're not even Irish." Helena smiled and pulled her daughter close. "Because this meal taught me something important, Liebchen. It taught me that kindness has a taste, and that taste is corned beef and cabbage served by men who chose to see people instead of enemies." She thought about Private Chen, who had returned to San Francisco and opened his own restaurant. About Sergeant O'Brien, who had remained a lifelong friend through letters and occasional visits. About Captain Hayes, who had understood that showing mercy to defeated enemies was not weakness but strength. They had all chosen kindness when hatred would have been easier, and that choice had changed everything.